What if the person you trusted most was hiding the darkest secret beneath your very own home? For 24 years, a daughter was trapped in a basement while the world above carried on like nothing was wrong. If you've ever witnessed, survived, or even sensed a story like this, share it in the comments. And while you're here, tell us where you're watching from. We want to know how far this story reaches. Stay with us until the end. The late summer sun cast long golden streaks across Salem, Oregon. A quiet suburban street rested in calm silence. The kind of neighborhood where people waved to one another across neatly trimmed lawns, and where Sunday church bells felt like the heartbeat of the community. On Maple Drive, the Donovan home stood tall and respectable, a two-story house with white siding and a well-kept yard. To every neighbor, Richard Donovan was the model of discipline. A father who had worked as an electrical engineer for nearly 3 decades, a church deacon, a man who never missed a mortgage payment or a morning coffee at the local diner. But behind that freshly painted white fence, something darker brewed. Sarah Donovan, his eldest daughter, had just turned 18. She had dreams too big for the town, too restless for the kind of life her father demanded. She wanted to move to Portland, take courses in cosmetology, and maybe, for the first time, decide for herself what her life would look like. She had been secretly saving money from babysitting jobs, storing crumpled bills inside a worn paperback book she kept under her mattress. That August evening, the argument began like all the others, low voices at first, then rising until the walls seemed to tremble. Margaret Donovan, Sarah's mother, tried to stay busy in the kitchen, clattering pots louder than usual, as if the noise could drown out the storm brewing in the living room. "I'm leaving after the weekend, Dad," Sarah said, her voice shaking but firm. "I've already spoken to a friend in Portland. I can stay with her until I find my own place." Richard set down his briefcase with a sharp thud. He adjusted the cuffs of his pressed shirt, every movement precise, calculated. His face was unreadable, except for the tightening around his jaw. "You think you're grown," he said, his tone calm but cold. "But in this house, as long as you live under my roof, you follow my rules." "I'm not your project," Sarah snapped, her fists clenching. "I'm not some doll you can lock up and control. I want my own life." The silence that followed was worse than yelling. Richard stepped forward, the sharp echo of his shoes against the hardwood filling the room. His eyes, steel gray and unyielding, fixed on her. "You will not embarrass this family," he said, his voice dropping low. "Tomorrow, we'll discuss this again, when you've come to your senses." But Sarah wasn't backing down this time. "No, Dad, tomorrow I won't be here." For a split second, something flickered across Richard's face. Shock, maybe even fear. But then it vanished behind a mask of control. He gave a tight smile, nodded once, and turned away. That night, Sarah packed a small bag. Margaret peeked into the room, her lips trembling as if she wanted to say something, but she never did. Sarah kissed her on the cheek, whispered, "I love you," and promised she'd call when she settled in. The next morning, Sarah Donovan was gone. Neighbors recalled seeing her walking down the street at dawn, her backpack slung over one shoulder. Others swore they heard Richard's car starting unusually early. By the time evening fell, Richard had already called the police. "She's been troubled," he told the officers with a weary shake of his head. "She got mixed up with some religious group." She left a note. He handed them a neatly folded letter, written in Sarah's handwriting. "Don't look for me. I've found peace with people who understand me. Please don't try to find me." Margaret burst into tears when she read it. "It doesn't sound like her," she whispered, but Richard's steady voice smoothed over every doubt. "It's her, Margaret. She's gone. She chose this life." The Salem police opened a missing persons case, but with no signs of foul play and a handwritten letter that seemed authentic, the file was soon marked voluntary disappearance. To the community, Sarah Donovan had run away like so many restless teenagers chasing a different truth. But the truth was something far more terrifying. 2 nights before she was reported missing, Richard had asked Sarah to help him move boxes into the newly finished basement. He had been working on the project for months, telling neighbors it was just extra storage space. The walls were reinforced concrete, the door concealed behind a utility shelf, the air pumped in through a ventilation system he had designed himself. Sarah had hesitated at the top of the stairs, her instincts screaming. "Why do you need me down there?" she asked nervously. "Because I can't carry it all myself," Richard said, his smile thin and unnatural. When the heavy steel door clanged shut behind her, she spun around, laughing nervously. "Is this some kind of joke?" But Richard didn't answer. The first hours were chaos, Sarah pounding on the door, screaming her mother's name, clawing at the walls until her nails split. She thought surely someone would hear her, the neighbors, her brothers, maybe even Margaret upstairs. But the walls swallowed every sound. Later that evening, Richard returned with a blanket, a plate of food, and a single warning. "You'll stay here until you learn respect." Sarah's eyes widened with disbelief. "Dad, please, this isn't real." But it was. Days blurred into weeks. Richard brought down food, forced her to rewrite letters until they sounded convincingly detached, then mailed them himself. To the outside world, Sarah had run away. Inside, Sarah's reality had collapsed into 4 concrete walls, a flickering light bulb, and the sound of a deadbolt locking behind her. By September, Margaret stopped mentioning her daughter's name. Neighbors shook their heads, muttering how sad it was that Sarah had gotten caught up with those cult types. Richard accepted their condolences with a solemn nod, sipping his coffee at the diner like nothing in the world had changed. But beneath his house, everything had changed. Sarah sat curled up on a cot, her hands shaking, her mind clawing for something to hold on to. She scratched lines into the wall with a bent nail, one for each day, refusing to let herself disappear completely. She whispered to herself at night, repeating childhood prayers, humming songs her mother once sang while folding laundry. Anything to keep from losing the sound of her own voice. Upstairs, life continued. The Donovans hosted barbecues, went to Sunday service, waved to neighbors across the lawn. To everyone, they looked like the perfect American family. But Sarah knew better. And as the months passed, a single question gnawed at her. Would anyone ever come looking again? By winter, the notches Sarah had carved into the concrete already stretched in long rows. One night, as she pressed her ear to the wall, she thought she heard something faint, almost like footsteps from above. Her heart hammered in her chest. "Mom," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Can you hear me?" Silence. Only the low hum of the ventilation system. But then, just before Richard turned the key in the lock, Sarah swore she heard a different sound. A soft draft of real air brushing across her cheek, cold and sharp. It came from somewhere in the corner of the room. A vent. A whisper of the world she'd been stolen from. And in that breath of air she felt it hope. But was it a lifeline? Or just another cruel trick of the basement? The first time Sarah felt that faint current of cold air against her cheek, she thought she was hallucinating. It was December in Oregon, the kind of winter where the rain never seemed to stop, and the streets outside her father's house were slick with ice. Sarah had already lost track of how many weeks she'd been trapped underground. The marks on the wall told her months had passed, though the days bled into each other like watercolor on wet paper. She pressed her hand against the vent high in the corner, stretching on tiptoe just to feel it. The air was sharp, raw, different from the recycled hum of the ventilation system her father had installed. For the first time since the door slammed shut, she felt something that didn't belong to Richard's world. Something from outside. But Richard noticed everything. The next evening when he came down with food, a small plate of beans, a slice of white bread, he followed Sarah's gaze toward the vent. His jaw tightened. He set the plate on the metal table and stepped toward the corner. "You don't need to worry about that," he said, his voice measured. He tapped the grate once, then looked at her. "Air is air. You're alive because of me. Don't forget that." Sarah wanted to scream, but she bit her tongue. She had already learned what happened when she pushed too hard. The first time she'd yelled through the door, pounding until her knuckles bled, he had come down with a length of rubber hose. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. He delivered each strike with a mechanic's precision, as if repairing something broken. When he left her, sobbing on the cot, he said only, "This is what happens when you disturb the peace." So Sarah stayed quiet. On the outside. But inside, she was beginning to plan. Richard Donovan had always been a man of order. He kept his tools lined up in perfect rows, his shirts ironed so sharp they looked like they could cut. To the neighbors, that order looked like discipline. To Sarah, trapped below, it was a prison. He created rules for her basement life. No screaming, no crying at night, meals only when he decided. Letters must be written exactly as he dictated. He even brought down a Bible and demanded she memorize verses. When she recited correctly, she might get an extra apple slice or an additional blanket. When she faltered, he reminded her that obedience was survival. But Sarah had her own rules. She recited poems she remembered from high school, over and over, to keep her mind from unraveling. She hummed songs her mother used to sing while folding laundry. She scratched notches into the wall until her fingers were raw, refusing to let her days blur into nothing. Sometimes, at night, she whispered her own name into the darkness. Sarah Donovan. Sarah Donovan. Just to remind herself she still existed. By the spring of 1988, Richard introduced something new, a small black and white television set. It had no antenna, only a built-in VHS player. He brought stacks of tapes, old church sermons, grainy educational films, black and white comedies from the 1960 seconds. "This will help you pass the time," he said, plugging it in. At first, Sarah refused to touch it. She sat in silence, glaring at the machine as if it were part of his plan to rewire her mind. But after weeks of nothing but her own breathing and the flicker of the ceiling bulb, she pressed play. The images frozen smiles, canned laughter. Sermons about sin felt both absurd and devastating. The world above was moving on, captured in cheap film stock, while her life had stopped. Richard watched her carefully. He wanted to see her broken, but not destroyed. He needed her alive, and alive meant dependent. In the fall of 1988, Sarah's body began to change. She felt sick in the mornings, her stomach twisting, her clothes tighter. She knew what it meant before she said the word aloud. Pregnant. The realization fell on her like a weight she couldn't move. At first she denied it, telling herself maybe it was stress, maybe her body was rebelling from the lack of sunlight and nutrition. But as her belly swelled, the truth grew undeniable. Richard noticed immediately. He didn't look shocked. If anything, he looked satisfied. "Children give life meaning," he told her one evening, as if he were doing her a kindness. "This will keep you grounded." Sarah turned her face to the wall, bile rising in her throat. She wanted to claw her skin off, but in the months that followed, she forced herself to prepare. She read an old medical pamphlet Richard brought, practicing breathing techniques on the thin mattress, gripping a pillow against her stomach. When labor came, it was night though. Night meant nothing underground. Contractions ripped through her body like fire. She crouched on the cold cement floor, sweat pouring, biting down on a rag to keep from screaming too loud. There was no nurse, no medication, only a dim, flickering bulb, and the sound of her own cries echoing back at her. Hours later, a baby's wail filled the basement. Sarah held the tiny girl against her chest, trembling, sobbing, whispering words of love she didn't know if she still believed. The child's eyes blinked open, wide and unknowing, as if asking what kind of world she had been born into. Sarah named her Emily. For a fleeting moment, Sarah felt something she hadn't in months' purpose. She rocked the baby, sang softly, letting her small heartbeat sync with her own. For the first time since the door slammed shut, Sarah felt like maybe she wasn't entirely lost. But Richard had his own vision. As Emily grew, Richard visited more often. He brought blocks, dolls, picture books. He acted like a father, though Sarah never let him hold the child for long. She watched his every move, every word, her body tense like a shield. Then came the rules for Emily. No noise after bedtime, no asking questions about the world above. Richard wanted silence, obedience, structure. Sarah wanted the opposite. She whispered stories to Emily about trees that turned red in the fall, about oceans that stretched forever, about skies so big they could swallow you whole. Emily would touch the walls and ask, "Mommy, where do the clouds live?" Sarah would hold her close and say, "Up above, waiting for us." Richard hated those stories. "You're filling her head with lies," he snapped. "They're not lies," Sarah whispered back. "They're the truth you're afraid of." In 1989, Sarah gave birth again. This time, a boy. She named him Michael. The labor was longer, more brutal, leaving her body torn and exhausted. Richard built a small extension to the basement, a crude additional room, but it was still no bigger than a closet. Months later, Michael grew sick. His breathing was shallow, his tiny chest rattling with every gasp. Sarah begged for a doctor, medicine, anything. Richard shook his head. "He wouldn't survive up there," he said coldly. Michael died in Sarah's arms one rainy November night. She screamed into the pillow, rocking his limp body until Richard came and took him away. He never said where. She never saw him again. Something inside Sarah shattered that day, but something else hardened too. She would never stop fighting, not for herself, but for the children who still breathed. By 1990, Sarah had given birth 3 times. Emily was now a bright toddler, full of questions that made Richard uneasy. She loved climbing the shelves, pretending they led to the sky. Sometimes she pressed her face against the vent, whispering, "Clouds, can you hear me?" Sarah clung to those moments. They meant Emily hadn't been broken yet. But Richard was watching. And Richard was planning. That winter, Richard sat at the edge of the basement, his eyes unreadable. "This can't go on forever," he murmured. "Too many mouths. Too much noise." Sarah's blood ran cold. The next morning she woke to find Michael's crib gone. His blanket folded neatly on the shelf. Richard said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence spoke louder than words. Sarah clutched Emily against her chest, her heart pounding with a single thought. How many more children would he take? One night, as Emily drifted to sleep on her lap, Sarah pressed her ear to the vent again. For a moment, she thought she heard it, footsteps above. Faint but real. Someone moving furniture. A chair scraping. Her pulse raced. "Hello?" she whispered desperately. "Please, please hear me." The sound stopped. Silence returned. But Sarah knew something for certain. There was still life above. People. A world. And maybe, just maybe, someone would listen. The question was, would they hear her in time? By the early 90s, Sarah Donovan's world had narrowed into rhythms of survival. The seasons outside changed, but in the basement there was only the faint buzz of the fluorescent bulb and the chill of concrete that never warmed. She had long since stopped counting days with scratches on the wall. There were too many to keep track of. Instead, her life became measured in heartbeats, in the steady rise and fall of her children's breathing as they slept beside her. Emily was 4 by then, curious, intense, with questions far too big for a room so small. She pressed her palms against the walls as though she could push her way through. "Mommy," she would ask in her tiny, insistent voice, "what do clouds feel like? Are they soft, like blankets, or do they sting, like cold water?" Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat each time. She'd gather Emily in her lap and whisper stories of skies painted pink at sunset, of rivers running fast enough to carry sticks downstream, of apple trees heavy with fruit. She never told her daughter about the cage they lived in. Instead, she painted pictures of the world above, because hope, Sarah knew, was as necessary as food. Richard hated it. "They don't need fantasies," he snapped one evening, standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the yellow light from upstairs. "They need discipline. They need order." Sarah hugged Emily closer, meeting his gaze without flinching. "No," she said softly. "They need to know there's something more than this." His eyes hardened, but he didn't argue. He simply closed the door, the deadbolt slamming shut like a judge's gavel. The children kept coming. In 1992, Sarah gave birth to a boy she named Joshua. His cries echoed against the concrete walls like a desperate hymn. Richard brought down extra supplies, formula, diapers, a crib assembled in the corner, but never affection. He observed from a distance, as if the children were part of an experiment. When Joshua grew into a quiet, thoughtful toddler, Sarah noticed something remarkable. He never liked the flickering fluorescent light. Instead, he'd trace the shadows on the wall, making shapes with his small hands. "Look, Mommy," he whispered one evening, forming the outline of a bird. "That's the sky bird. It's waiting." Sarah's throat tightened. She kissed his forehead. Yes, sweetheart. It's waiting for us. By the mid-90s, there were 5 children in the basement. Their games were made from scraps, bottle caps became coins, shoelaces turned into skipping ropes. The empty cardboard boxes Richard sometimes brought down became castles and forts. They sang songs they made up, laughing until their stomachs ached. For a moment, even Sarah could forget the weight of the walls. But Richard's presence never allowed the illusion to last. He arrived on his own schedule, sometimes with food, sometimes with punishments. He lectured them on obedience, quoting verses, preaching his twisted version of morality. "The world above is poison," he said one night, his voice carrying the authority of a pastor. "You are safe here. You belong to me." Sarah clenched her fists, her face a mask of calm. She never contradicted him in front of the children. She had learned that defiance in those moments only led to more suffering later. But when the door closed and the locks snapped back into place, she gathered her children close. "You are not what he says you are," she whispered. "You are more. You are stronger." Those late-night lessons were the only rebellion she had left. Not every child was allowed to stay. 3 times, Sarah awoke to find one of her babies gone. No warning, no explanation. Just an empty crib, a folded blanket, and Richard's cold assurance that they're being cared for. Each loss hollowed her out. Each silence carved another scar across her heart. But she never let the surviving children see her break. She smiled for them, sang for them, carried the weight of their belief. One evening, Emily asked, "Where's baby Claire? Did she go to see the clouds?" Sarah's chest ached. She forced a nod, tears burning her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart. She went to visit the clouds. And one day, we'll see her again." Richard smirked when he heard. But Sarah didn't care. She would not let him have the last word. As the years dragged on, the basement itself began to betray them. Mold crept into the corners, turning the air heavy with damp. The small heater sputtered through winters, barely holding off the bone-deep cold. The children coughed at night, their voices raspy, their skin pale from the absence of sunlight. Sarah begged Richard for medicine, for vitamins, for more than scraps. Sometimes he gave an aspirin, a jar of cough syrup, but always with strings attached. "Obedience earns rewards," he reminded her. Still, Sarah clung to her secret resistance. She hid scraps of paper under the mattress, scribbling notes when she could. Dates, patterns, the times Richard visited, the words he used. She was building a map, a record of truth. If anyone ever came, she would have proof. And she kept teaching. Letters drawn in chalk on the floor. Numbers traced into dust. Songs recited like prayers. "Remember this," she told Emily and Joshua, "because one day when we are free, you'll need to know everything he tried to keep from you." Emily became the boldest. By the time she turned 10, her questions had sharpened into defiance. "Why can't we see the sky?" she demanded one evening, her fists balled. "Why do we have to stay down here? Other kids don't live like this." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Because the world outside would destroy you," he snapped. "You have no idea what's out there." "Yes, I do," Emily shot back, her voice trembling but fierce. "Because Mommy told me." For the first time, Richard struck her across the face. The sound cracked like thunder in the small room. Sarah lunged forward, shielding Emily, fury blazing in her chest. "That's enough," she shouted, her voice shaking. "If you ever touch her again." But Richard silenced her, with a look so cold it froze the words in her throat. He left without another word, the locks clanging shut like a final verdict. That night, Emily cried in Sarah's arms. "Don't let him win," Sarah whispered. "He wants to make us small, but we are bigger than his walls." By 2000, the basement was more crowded than ever. The children had grown into adolescents, their bodies stretching against the limits of the room. They were restless, louder, harder to control. Richard tried tightening his rules, but cracks had begun to show. Joshua, quiet and observant, stared at Richard with eyes that didn't fear him anymore. He studied every movement, every habit, every detail of the locks. Emily grew pale and thin, her body suffering from years of malnutrition. Her skin bruised easily, her bones fragile. She coughed at night until her chest rattled, but her spirit burned hotter than ever. "Mom," she whispered one evening, "I think I hate him." Sarah stroked her hair, torn between grief and pride. "Hate will eat you alive, Emily. Don't give him that power. Hold on to who you are." In 2005, disaster came. Emily collapsed one night, her body racked by seizures. The other children screamed as Sarah tried to hold her still, her own hands shaking uncontrollably. "Please, God, don't take her," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. Richard rushed down, his face pale. For the first time in years, Sarah saw fear in his eyes. Emily's condition was beyond what he could control. He stared at his daughter convulsing on the floor, and for a moment, his carefully built world cracked. "We need a hospital," Sarah begged. "She's going to die if you don't." Richard's jaw clenched. He hated losing control, but even he couldn't ignore the truth. The next morning, he carried Emily up the stairs. Sarah pressed her hands to her mouth, choking back a sob as the door closed behind them. It was the first time in nearly 2 decades that one of her children had touched the world above. Hours later, Sarah sat in the basement, clutching Joshua to her chest. The silence was unbearable. Every creak of the floor above made her heart lurch. Then footsteps, but not Richard's. Softer, different. The basement door stayed shut, but Sarah knew. Someone else was up there. And if someone else saw Emily, if someone else asked the right questions, could this finally be the crack in Richard's perfect facade? The hospital smelled of disinfectant and rain. Richard Donovan walked the sterile halls with Emily in his arms, her thin body jerking with seizures that terrified even him. Nurses swarmed, voices clipped and urgent, as they placed her on a gurney. Richard explained too smoothly, too quickly. "My granddaughter, her mother abandoned her. I've been raising her alone. She's been sick for years. I tried my best." His laminated ID card flashed like a shield. Emily was rushed into emergency care. Richard stood outside the glass, his face composed but his eyes calculating. He hated the hospital. Too many questions, too many forms. But what choice did he have? If Emily died, Sarah would break completely, and even Richard's perfect system couldn't survive that. Down in the basement, Sarah waited in silence. The hours stretched into a fog. She held Joshua and Monica close, whispering comfort she didn't feel herself. Every thump above made her heart leap. She imagined doctors leaning over Emily, strangers finally seeing what years of confinement had done. Would they notice the bruises that never fully healed, the bones too brittle for a girl her age? Would they believe the story Richard had polished for decades? When he finally returned, the basement door opened slowly. Richard stepped in, his expression unreadable. Sarah jumped to her feet, eyes wild. "Where is she?" she demanded. "She's alive," he said flatly. "They stabilized her. She'll be there for a while." Sarah's knees buckled, relief flooded her, but it was laced with fear. Emily was above. Emily was visible, and visibility was dangerous for Richard, for his lies, for all of them. Richard seemed to sense it. His voice sharpened. "Not a word, Sarah. If she says something foolish, no one will believe her. No one ever has. Remember that." But for the first time, Sarah wasn't so sure. Detective Anna Ramirez had only been in Salem, Oregon for 6 months. She'd transferred from Los Angeles, chasing the quieter rhythm of a small city, a place where crime reports usually meant petty theft or drunk driving. But on a gray Tuesday morning, a thin file landed on her desk. Patient admitted. Female, approximately 16, malnourished, no school records, no vaccination history, no birth certificate confirmed. Anna frowned. That wasn't neglect. That was erasure. She visited the hospital that afternoon. Behind the glass, Emily lay pale and motionless, machines beeping a fragile rhythm. Nurses described brittle bones, organ stress, vitamin deficiencies they hadn't seen outside of third-world malnutrition cases. "She looks like she's never been outside," one nurse whispered, her voice breaking. Anna felt a chill crawl up her spine. Richard Donovan introduced himself in the cafeteria with the same polished charm he'd shown neighbors for decades. A retired contractor, a devoted father abandoned by a wayward daughter, a grandfather doing his best. He slid papers across the table: school registration forms, a forged birth certificate, notes written in careful cursive. Her mother left her with me when she was just a baby, he explained smoothly. Ran off with some religious group. Never came back. Anna studied him. His suit was pressed, his hair neat, his words too practiced. She smiled politely, but inside her instinct screamed. That night, she reopened an old file. Sarah Donovan, missing since 1987, declared a runaway. A single letter had closed the case. Don't look for me. I've joined a group. I'm fine. Anna compared the shaky handwriting in the letter to the neat school forms Richard had just provided. Something didn't fit. The case she had inherited was about a girl in a hospital bed. But suddenly, Anna was staring at a woman who had vanished almost 20 years ago. In the basement, Sarah didn't know any of this. All she knew was that Emily hadn't come home yet, and Richard was growing more agitated by the day. He checked locks twice, sometimes 3 times, pacing the small workshop above as if waiting for the world to crash in. The children sensed it too. Joshua whispered to Monica at night, wondering if their sister would ever come back. Felix, the youngest, clung to Sarah's arm, refusing to sleep without her heartbeat near. Sarah tried to stay strong, but every time the floorboards creaked overhead, her stomach twisted with both hope and dread. If Emily spoke, if someone believed her, maybe rescue wasn't just a fantasy whispered through a vent. Richard must have seen the shift in her eyes, because one evening he yanked her aside, his grip bruising. If you say a word, if you even think about it, I will make sure they all disappear. Do you understand me? Sarah met his stare. She said nothing. But inside, her resolve hardened like stone. Weeks later, Anna returned to the hospital. To her surprise, she wasn't met with Richard's smile this time. Instead, she found someone else sitting quietly at Emily's bedside. A thin woman, older than the photo in the 1987 file, but with the same sharp cheekbones, the same sad eyes. Anna froze. Sarah Donovan? She whispered. The woman flinched but said nothing. She clutched Emily's hand, her gaze darting toward the door. Anna crouched beside her. My name is Anna. I'm with the police. I want to help you, but I need to know the truth. Sarah's lips trembled. For a long moment she was silent. Then, barely audible, she whispered, If I talk, he'll kill them. Anna's breath caught. She reached for Sarah's hand. Who? Sarah's eyes filled with tears. My children. They're still there, underground. The words hung between them like a live wire. Anna felt her pulse hammering. She had suspected secrets. She hadn't expected this. Richard sensed the danger immediately. When Sarah returned to the basement after the hospital visit, he confronted her. Who did you talk to? His voice was low, dangerous. No one, she whispered. Don't lie to me. He shook her, his face inches from hers. If they come here, if they take you out, you'll never see your children again. Do you understand? Sarah stared back at him, her fear eclipsed by something else, a glimmer of defiance he hadn't seen in years. I think we already survived you. For a moment, Richard faltered. The girl he had locked away had become a woman who no longer cowered. It unnerved him. Upstairs, Anna filed her emergency report. The inconsistencies in Richard's building permits, the strange power usage in his home, the gaps in Sarah's records. It wasn't enough for a warrant yet, but she knew she was close. She requested surveillance. It was denied. Her superiors said she was overreaching, but Anna couldn't let it go. Something about the way Sarah's eyes had burned through her whispered words. They're still there. The cracks in Richard's empire widened. He noticed the unmarked car parked across the street too often, different drivers behind the wheel. He doubled his checks, locked windows twice, paced through the night. One morning, Sarah woke to find him sitting in the basement, just watching her and the children. His eyes darted from face to face like a man taking inventory. Finally, he whispered almost to himself, They're coming. She froze. Who? He didn't answer. Hours later, Sarah pressed her ear to the vent again. This time she didn't just hear footsteps. She heard voices, low, muffled, but real. She pressed her mouth close to the grate and whispered, We're here. Please hear us. For the first time in decades, she felt the impossible someone might actually be listening. The following morning, just before dawn, the quiet neighborhood erupted with the sound of heavy boots on Richard's front porch. Sarah woke to the thud of fists against the door, loud and unrelenting. "Police! Open up!" Her heart pounded. She gathered the children close, tears streaming down her face. Above, the locks turned. Richard's footsteps echoed like thunder, and for the first time in 24 years, the door to their prison began to shake. The pounding on the front door came like a drumbeat of justice. Richard Donovan froze halfway down the stairs, his robe hanging loose, his hands trembling for the first time in decades. The sound was unmistakable police. He had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his nightmares, but the reality was louder, more final. "Police! Open the door!" Sarah clutched her children in the basement, her arms wrapped around Joshua and Monica, her cheek pressed against Felix's hair. For a heartbeat, she thought she was dreaming, but the vibrations shook the walls. The voices were real. After 24 years, someone had finally come. Upstairs, Richard shuffled to the door, trying to compose himself. He opened it just wide enough to reveal his tired face, feigning confusion. Detective Anna Ramirez stood at the center of 2 uniformed officers, her expression stone cold. "Mr. Donovan," she said, voice firm, "we have a warrant to search your property." Richard blinked. "A warrant? For what?" "For your basement." Silence. For a fraction of a second, Richard considered slamming the door, but the officers moved in, pushing past him. Boots stomped across the tile, radios crackled, beams of flashlights swept through the house. The facade he had built for nearly a quarter century was cracking before his eyes. "Step así decir," Anna ordered. Richard raised his hand slowly, his lips twitching with a bitter smile. "You don't understand. I was protecting them. Then." But his words meant nothing now. The officers spread out, combing through rooms, searching for inconsistencies. In the utility room, Anna stopped in front of a shelf that looked too solid, too deliberate. She pulled it aside with the help of another officer. Behind it was a heavy steel door. Her heart raced. She pressed her palm to the cold metal. "This is it. Key," she demanded, turning back to Richard. For the first time, his composure cracked. His hand shook as he pulled a ring of keys from his pocket. He fit one into the lock, then another. The third resisted before finally clicking open. The hinges groaned, releasing a smell that made even the most hardened officers flinch. Stale air, damp cement, years of mold and human suffering. Anna raised her flashlight and stepped inside. The beam cut through the darkness, catching a narrow corridor lined with more doors. The concrete walls were stained, frayed bedding shoved into corners, rust creeping across fixtures. Then movement. Small faces squinted against the sudden light. Pale skin, wide eyes, bodies recoiling like shadows afraid of fire. Anna's throat tightened. Children. At the far end, a woman stepped forward, shielding them with her arms. Her hair was dull, her face thin, her body trembling. But her eyes were alive. "Sarah Donovan," Anna whispered. The woman blinked, stunned. Behind her, a little girl whimpered. Another boy covered his ears. The light was too much, too sudden. Anna lowered her flashlight. "It's okay. You're safe now." Sarah's knees bent, as if her body might collapse. She hadn't stood fully upright in years. Her lips trembled. "Where's Emily?" she asked in a cracked whisper. "She's in the hospital," Anna said softly. "She's alive." The words broke Sarah open. Tears spilled down her face as she clutched the nearest child, holding them tight. For so long she had dreamed of hearing those words, and now they were real. Officers rushed forward with blankets, oxygen, and stretchers. The children blinked against the light, crying out as the flashlights swept across their faces. Even the toughest cops had to look away, their throats tight, their eyes wet. "Easy, easy," one medic whispered, wrapping Felix in a warm blanket. "You're safe. We've got you." Sarah stumbled as she tried to follow, her legs trembling. The moment her foot touched the grass outside, she fell to her knees. Her hands pressed into the earth, fingers digging into the soil. She inhaled sharply, overwhelmed by the smell of damp grass, the softness beneath her skin, the open air against her face. The sky above was too bright, too wide. She shielded her eyes, sobbing. For 24 years she had dreamed of this moment. Nothing could have prepared her for how it felt. The children screamed at the sunlight, burying their faces in Sarah's lap. Felix wailed. Monica cried into a medic's chest. Their fragile eyes watered instantly. But slowly, gently, they began to adjust. The neighbors had gathered outside in their robes, whispering in disbelief. For decades they had waved at Richard, chatted about gardening and taxes, and never once imagined the horror beneath his floors. "Dear God," one woman murmured. "All this time, right next door." Richard stood handcuffed on the porch, his face eerily blank. He didn't shout. He didn't resist. He simply watched as Sarah and the children were carried out of the basement, one by one. When Sarah looked up at him, their eyes met for the first time in years, without the filter of concrete walls between them. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her gaze said everything: hatred, defiance, survival. Richard looked back like a man who had lost his kingdom. For 24 years, he had been master of his own twisted world. Now it was gone, stripped from him in a single morning. At the hospital, the children were placed in real beds, covered with clean sheets, given food that wasn't rationed, water that wasn't stale. Doctors moved quickly, testing blood, examining bones, treating infections. Some of the children cried silently, unable to process the flood of new sensations, the softness of mattresses, the sound of televisions, the brightness of lamps. Sarah sat beside Emily's bed, holding her daughter's fragile hand. Emily's color was better now, her breathing steadier. Sarah leaned down and whispered through tears, "We made it. You held on. I did too." In the next room, Joshua and Monica slept curled up together. Felix whimpered in his sleep but didn't let go of the teddy bear a nurse had handed him. For the first time, he held something soft that wasn't made from scraps. Anna stood outside the glass, her hands in her pockets, her eyes burning. She had seen violent crimes, drug busts, broken families, but nothing had prepared her for the sight of children blinking at sunlight for the first time. She knew this case would haunt her forever. The media swarmed. News vans lined the street. Helicopters circled overhead. Headlines screamed across every channel. 24 years underground. House of horror in Salem. Mother and children freed after decades. Reporters whispered the word dungeon, as if it were myth made real. Neighbors wept on camera, saying they had noticed nothing, that Richard had seemed strict but polite, a man of order, of discipline. How could something so monstrous hide in plain sight? Back at the station, Richard was placed in a plain white interrogation room. For the first time in decades, he had no keys, no locks, no control. Just 4 walls and the steady gaze of Detective Anna Ramirez. "You know why you're here," she said quietly. Richard leaned back, chains clinking softly. "I protected them," he said. His voice was calm, almost proud. "The world above is filth. They were safe with me, fed, sheltered, taught morals." Anna's jaw tightened. "You imprisoned your daughter for 24 years. You raped her. You stole her children. You deceived an entire town." He didn't flinch. "I built that house. Every brick, every bolt. Do you think anyone questioned me? They never saw me." Anna leaned forward. Her voice was steady, but her eyes burned. "No, and that's the problem." The trial was still far away, the headlines still unfolding. But for Sarah, recovery was already beginning. She planted her feet firmly in the grass outside the hospital one afternoon, breathing deep, whispering words only she and the sky could hear. "We are still here." But even as she whispered, she knew shadows lingered. The world had finally found them, but the scars of captivity would not vanish overnight. The children's nightmares, her own flashbacks, the whispers of Richard's threats, these would linger. And yet, for the first time in decades, possibility stretched wider than the basement walls. Later that night, in the sterile quiet of the hospital, Sarah woke to the sound of a nurse adjusting IV bags. She sat up, her eyes drawn to the hallway. Through the glass, she saw Richard being led past in shackles, escorted to a secure holding cell. Their eyes met for a single moment. His face was unreadable, but his lips moved. 4 words, "You'll never escape me." Sarah's heart froze, because even behind bars, his shadow still reached for her. The courthouse in Salem was older than most of the people who filled its wooden benches. On the morning of Richard Donovan's trial, the air was thick with the low hum of whispers, the shuffle of reporters, the click of cameras outside. Journalists had flown in from New York, Los Angeles, even London. Every headline for weeks had carried his name, painted in bold letters like a stain no one could scrub away. The father of evil, the monster next door. Inside, the atmosphere was taut, brittle. Every creak of the benches felt amplified, every cough swallowed in silence. The jury sat stiff, their faces pale with anticipation. No one had expected this kind of horror in a quiet Oregon town. Richard was led in through a side door, shackled, but walking with the same composure he'd carried into church on Sundays. His gray hair was neatly combed, his suit pressed. For a moment, he looked less like a criminal and more like the respectable neighbor he had pretended to be for decades. That, perhaps, was the most terrifying part. When Sarah entered, the room shifted. She wore black, her hair pulled back tightly, her face pale but determined. She requested no cameras, no live broadcast. She wanted her voice heard, not her image consumed. The silence that followed her steps was heavy. People turned in their seats, watching her as though they were seeing a ghost walk among them. She sat behind the prosecution table, hands folded, her eyes fixed straight ahead. She would not look at Richard. Not yet. The prosecution laid out its case with relentless precision. False imprisonment, rape, incest, abuse, neglect. The list of charges ran like a litany of sins, each word cutting deeper into the collective conscience of the courtroom. The lead prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Karen Whitfield, stood before the jury. "For 24 years, she said, her voice echoing, this man built a world of concrete and locks, a world where he was judge, jury, and God. He stole a woman's youth, her freedom, and forced her children to be born into darkness. Today, we return their voices. Today, we demand justice." Richard's defense attorney painted a different picture, one that made the jurors stiffen in discomfort. "My client is not a monster," he argued. "He is a man who believed the world outside was dangerous. He provided food, shelter, education. Flawed, yes, but not malicious. He loved his daughter. He loved those children. Loved." The word made Sarah's stomach turn. When it was time for her to testify, Sarah walked to the witness stand slowly, as though each step carried the weight of every year she had spent underground. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and lifted her eyes toward the jury. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled. She told them about the night the door closed, about the suffocating darkness, about the notches she carved into the wall until her fingers bled. She described the births, the cries of her babies, the ones who disappeared without explanation. She told them about Michael, the infant who died in her arms, and how Richard carried him away like he was nothing more than a broken toy. Her words did not rise to screams. They did not need to. The quiet in the room was enough. Even the judge looked down, blinking hard behind his glasses. Only once did Sarah's voice break when she spoke of Emily, and the day she was carried up the stairs, her body racked with seizures. "I thought that was the end," she whispered. "But it wasn't." She came back to me, and because of that, I'm here. She turned then, finally, to face Richard. Her eyes locked on him across the room. For a long moment, neither spoke. But in that silence, something passed between them. She wasn't the girl he had locked away anymore. She was the woman who had survived him. Richard looked away first. The children were spared from testifying directly. Doctors and psychologists explained the trauma, the fragile health, the years of developmental damage. One officer described the basement, the mold, the flickering lights, the air so heavy it choked. "It wasn't just a room," he said, voice thick with emotion. "It was a tomb built for the living." Neighbors testified too, their voices filled with guilt. "He was quiet, polite," one man said. "Strict, sure, but never this." Another woman wept on the stand. "I used to wave to him every Sunday. And all that time, those children, they were under our feet." The weight of shame hung over the community like a storm cloud. Richard, when called to testify, leaned back in his chair, chains clinking. His voice was calm, measured, almost righteous. "I created order," he said. "The world above is chaos, drugs, crime, sin. I gave them safety. I gave them discipline. I gave them purpose." The courtroom rippled with gasps. Karen Whitfield stepped closer, her voice like steel. "You raped your daughter. You imprisoned her for nearly 25 years. You watched your grandchildren suffer without sunlight, without medical care. You let a baby die. That is not order, Mr. Donovan. That is evil." Richard didn't flinch. "You call it evil. I call it protection." It was then Sarah realized something chilling. He truly believed it. When closing arguments came, the prosecution spoke of survival. "Sarah Donovan and her children are not just victims," Whitfield told the jury. "They are proof of resilience. But resilience does not erase crime. This man must be held accountable not just for what he did to them, but for what he says he believes is right. Because if we don't, then silence wins." The defense leaned on doubt, on technicalities, on Richard's age. But the jury's faces had already hardened. The deliberations lasted only a day. When they returned, the courtroom was silent. The foreman stood, his voice steady as he read each verdict. "Guilty, guilty, guilty." The words stacked like bricks on Richard's shoulders. "Life imprisonment." No parole. Sarah closed her eyes. Not in triumph, not even in relief, but in release. After the gavel fell, the reporters erupted outside. Headlines screamed, "Justice in Salem, evil sentenced, house of horror closed forever." The courthouse steps filled with microphones, flashes, questions hurled into the air. Sarah slipped out the back entrance, escorted by officers. She didn't want the cameras. She wanted the sky. That night, she sat on the hospital lawn, barefoot in the grass. The children slept upstairs, still trembling from nightmares, still waking at sudden noises. She breathed in the night air, the smell of rain-soaked earth, the vastness of the stars above. "We're free," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. But deep inside, shadows lingered. Richard was behind bars, but his voice still echoed in her head. His threats, his rules, his control, none of it would vanish with a verdict. Healing would take longer than justice. 2 weeks later, Sarah received a letter. The envelope bore no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Her stomach turned as she unfolded the page. 4 words stared back at her. "You'll never escape me." Her hands shook. She pressed the letter to her chest, staring at the apple tree outside her window. Richard was locked away. But somehow, his shadow was still reaching for her. The letter sat in Sarah's lap long after the words blurred together. "You'll never escape me." She had folded and unfolded the page until the creases cut white scars across the paper. The prison had assured her that Richard had no access to pens, no way to send mail. But the handwriting was as neat, deliberate, unmistakable. Sarah burned the letter in the kitchen sink. She watched the edges curl into black ash, smoke rising like a ghost. But even when the last fragment disappeared, the words remained. She carried them in her chest like an echo. Healing, she was learning, was not a straight line. It was a maze with walls that shifted when she least expected. The state had given her and the children new names, a new home in a quiet suburb outside Portland. From the street, the house looked ordinary. 2 stories, white shutters, a small yard with a young apple tree planted near the porch. To Sarah, it was both miracle and battlefield. Every creak of the floor made her flinch. Every closed door set her heart racing. The children, too, carried the shadows. Emily, now 17, moved through the world like someone walking on glass. The seizures had slowed with medication, but her eyes still darted to exits in every room. At night, She locked her bedroom door 3 times before lying down, clutching a flashlight under her pillow. Joshua retreated into silence. He filled notebooks with drawings of birds, open skies, staircases that led nowhere. When Sarah asked him what they meant, he just shrugged. "Dreams," he said softly. Monica refused to sleep alone. She dragged her blanket into Sarah's room, curling up at the foot of the bed like a child half her age. Felix, the youngest, clung to Sarah constantly. He pressed his ear to her heartbeat whenever she sat still, afraid that if he let go, she might disappear. Therapists came weekly. Social workers checked in monthly. Sarah listened to their gentle reassurances, their patient explanations of trauma, recovery, resilience. But late at night, when the house fell quiet, she still heard Richard's voice in the back of her mind, his rules, his threats, his sermons about order. She hated that even in freedom, he still lived inside her head. One morning, Sarah stood barefoot in the yard, staring at the apple tree. The branches were young, still thin, but buds had begun to form. She pressed her palm to the bark and whispered, "Grow stronger than the walls that held us." It became her ritual. Each day she watered it, watched it stretch upward, a reminder that life could push through even the hardest ground. The neighbors were curious, of course. Some whispered when they thought she wasn't listening. Others brought casseroles and warm smiles, pretending not to know who she really was. At a grocery store one afternoon, a stranger stopped her near the produce aisle. "You're her, aren't you, the woman from the news?" Sarah froze. Her throat closed. The stranger's eyes softened. "I just wanted to say you're stronger than anyone I've ever seen. My sister went through something smaller, but you give us hope." Sarah forced a smile, but inside she trembled. She didn't want to be a symbol. She just wanted to be a mother. The children struggled to adapt to school. Emily was placed in a program for teens with trauma. She made few friends, keeping to herself, wary of questions she couldn't answer. Joshua excelled in art, but recoiled when teachers asked him to present. Monica had night terrors that left her exhausted in class. Felix clung to Sarah at drop-off, his small fists refusing to let go of her coat. Sarah tried to encourage them, tried to remind them that freedom meant choices, voices, futures. But each day felt like a battle between the world they had known and the world they were supposed to join. At night, she sat at the kitchen table with a notebook, writing down everything, the progress, the setbacks, the little victories that no one else noticed. Monica laughed today at a joke on TV. Joshua opened the window without flinching. Emily asked me what college was like. Each entry was proof that they were still moving forward, even if the steps were small. One afternoon in 2015, Sarah was called to testify again, this time not in court, but before a state panel reviewing child welfare failures. She stood in a sterile conference room, under fluorescent lights, facing a row of officials in suits. "How," one of them asked, "could a man keep a woman and children hidden for 24 years without anyone noticing?" Sarah looked each of them in the eye. Her voice was steady. "Because people don't like to see what makes them uncomfortable. Because it's easier to believe a letter than to ask harder questions. Because we trust the respectable face more than the quiet cry. And because silence is safer." The room fell silent. Her words were written into the record, broadcast on local news, debated in editorials. Some called her brave. Others accused her of reopening wounds. But Sarah didn't care. She hadn't spoken for 2 decades. She wouldn't waste her voice now. By 2016, life had found new rhythms. Emily got her driver's license, though she gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. Joshua had an art show at a community center, his paintings filled with skies streaked in gold and birds in flight. Monica made a friend at school who loved to sing, and for the first time Sarah heard her daughter's laughter ring out without fear. Felix started kindergarten, clutching a crayon in his fist like it was a weapon against the dark. But the shadows remained. One night, Sarah woke to Emily sitting by the window, staring at the moon. "I still hear him," Emily whispered. Sarah sat beside her, pulling her close. "So do I. Do you think it'll ever stop?" Sarah thought of the letter she had burned, the words that lingered. She kissed her daughter's hair. "Maybe not, but the voice gets quieter when we live louder." Still, fear had a way of sneaking back in. One autumn evening, Sarah returned home from the grocery store to find the mailbox stuffed with envelopes. Among the bills and flyers was another unmarked letter. Her hands shook as she tore it open. This one contained no words, just a crude drawing of a basement door, locked from the outside. Her stomach dropped. She pressed the envelope flat on the table, her breath ragged. Was it Richard? Or someone who wanted to remind her that escape wasn't absolute? The children noticed her pale face. "What is it, Mom?" Joshua asked quietly. Sarah forced a smile, slipping the paper into her pocket. "Nothing," she lied. "Just junk mail." But that night, she buried the letter under the apple tree, her hands trembling as she pressed the dirt down. The next morning, Sarah stood in the yard, staring at the apple tree. Its branches were stronger now, stretching wider, leaves shimmering in the sunlight. For a moment, she felt peace. Then she noticed it. Car parked across the street, unmarked, engine running. The same kind of car that had once watched Richard before the raid. Her breath caught. Was it protection? Or was it a warning? She called the children inside, her eyes fixed on the car. For the first time in years, Sarah realized freedom might not be as simple as a locked door opening. Because some shadows follow you, even into the light. The car outside lingered for 3 days. Sarah watched from behind the curtain, her breath shallow, her stomach coiled in knots. Each time the engine turned over, each time the driver's silhouette shifted, she wondered if Richard had found a way to reach her, even from his cell. On the 4th day, it was gone. No explanation, no note, just the silence of an empty street. Sarah told no one, but the fear remained. Freedom, she realized, wasn't about locks or doors, it was about silence losing its power. And that battle was still being fought. The years that followed were uneven, like a road full of potholes. Some days were golden, filled with laughter, progress, and the smell of apple pie cooling on the counter. Other days were gray, haunted by nightmares and shadows that stretched longer than the walls of the old basement. Emily enrolled in community college. She studied social work, determined to use her pain as a compass for helping others. She walked into classrooms with her shoulders straight, even when her hands trembled. When Sarah saw her daughter stand at a podium one spring morning, speaking to a room of strangers about resilience, she wept quietly in the back row. Joshua's art found its way into galleries. His canvases were filled with skies so vast they seemed to burst off the walls, painted in colors he had never seen underground but somehow always imagined. Critics called his work haunting, yet hopeful. He called it simply freedom. Monica discovered music. She learned guitar from a neighbor and filled the house with melodies, sometimes soft and trembling, other times loud and defiant. Each note was a declaration. I'm here. I survived. Felix grew into a boy with wide eyes and a hunger for the world. He loved science, wanted to know how clouds formed, how rivers carved valleys, how stars burned billions of miles away. Every answer Sarah gave him was a gift, because for years she had been forced to lie, to pretend the world was smaller than it was. Now she could give him truth. Sarah herself struggled. Nights were still hard. She often woke sweating, convinced she could hear the scrape of keys in a lock. The echo of Richard's voice haunted her like a ghost in the rafters. But each morning she forced herself outside, barefoot in the grass, standing beneath the apple tree. By 2018, it had grown taller, its branches sturdy, its leaves shimmering with life. That summer, for the first time, it bore fruit. Small green apples, bitter but real. Sarah gathered her children beneath its shade and sliced one into pieces. They ate in silence, tears streaming, because it wasn't about the taste, it was about the promise fulfilled. The media tried to drag her back into the spotlight. Documentaries, interviews, book deals. Sarah refused most of them. She wasn't a spectacle. She was a mother. But once, she agreed to a local television special about survivors. She sat beneath the apple tree with a reporter and said, "We are not defined by what was taken from us. We are defined by what we choose to build after." Those words traveled further than she imagined. Letters arrived from strangers across the country, women in shelters, veterans with PTSD, children who had grown up in foster care. They thanked her for reminding them that darkness doesn't always win. But healing wasn't a straight path. One winter night, Emily came home shaking. She had seen a man on the bus who looked too much like Richard. Same mustache, same glasses. It wasn't him, but the terror was real. She sobbed in Sarah's arms, gasping that she would never escape. Sarah held her close, whispering, "We don't have to erase him. We just have to outlive him." That sentence became a family motto. Whenever nightmares came, whenever the shadows grew heavy, one of them would whisper it. We just have to outlive him. By 2019, the apple tree was strong enough for Felix to climb. Sarah watched him dangle from its branches, his laughter ringing out across the yard. For the first time, the sound didn't feel fragile. It felt permanent. That summer, Sarah invited Detective Ana Ramirez to dinner. They sat at the kitchen table while the children filled the house with chatter. Ana smiled softly. "Do you realize," she said, "how far you've come?" Sarah looked around the laughter, the music, the smell of food on the stove. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe. "Sometimes," she said, "I think we really made it." But the shadows hadn't vanished entirely. Richard Donovan died in prison that fall. The news reached Sarah in a plain phone call from a state official. "Heart failure," they said. "Natural causes, no funeral, no release." Just the quiet end of a man who had once believed he was God. When Sarah hung up the phone, she stood silently in the kitchen. Her hands trembled, not from fear, not from grief, but from the strange, dizzying release of a weight she had carried for decades. She walked outside to the apple tree, pressing her palm against the bark. The wind rustled through the branches, carrying the sound of her children laughing in the yard. "He's gone," she whispered, "and we're still here." That night, she sat with her children under the tree, the stars glimmering overhead. Emily leaned her head on Sarah's shoulder. Joshua sketched constellations in his notebook. Monica strummed her guitar softly. Felix lay in the grass, staring at the sky. They weren't healed completely. Maybe they never would be. But they were free. And freedom, Sarah realized, wasn't about forgetting. It was about choosing to live in the light, even with shadows at your back. She looked at her children, her survivors, her proof, and smiled. "Tomorrow," she said, "we'll make apple pie." For the first time, the word tomorrow didn't feel like a question. It felt like a promise. The story of Sarah Donovan and her children is not just a tale of tragedy. It is a testament to the unbreakable strength of the human spirit. For more than 2 decades, Sarah lived in a prison of concrete and silence, stripped of freedom, choice, and dignity. And yet, even in the darkest corners of captivity, she held on to something her captor could never take: hope. She whispered stories of skies and rivers to her children, planting seeds of imagination where sunlight could not reach. She carved truth into her memory, building a record of survival in a place meant to erase her. What does this mean for us? It reminds us that resilience is not about pretending the darkness never existed, it's about refusing to let it define us. Healing is rarely clean or easy. It comes in fragile steps, in moments when we choose laughter over fear, or when we dare to believe that tomorrow can be better than today. The story also forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about silence and society. For years, neighbors looked away, institutions failed, and a mask of respectability hid unthinkable crimes. It challenges us to listen more closely, to question what seems too neat, and to never dismiss the quiet cries around us. Most of all, Sarah's journey teaches that freedom is not only the absence of walls, it is the presence of possibility. It's the apple tree in her yard, growing stronger each year, reminding her family that life can take root even after years of being buried. This story matters because it shows us that even after unimaginable suffering, the light of courage, love, and resilience can break through, and when it does, it changes everything.